Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSet Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that we have started a series on political geography and today we are conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture, we will talk about environmental geopolitics. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert Dr. Asmita Bakshi. Dr. Bakshi is an expert in political geography, and on that note, we would like to welcome Dr. Bakshi to our show and request her to start the lecture. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Amrit. Welcome students. This lecture, as you all are aware, that this lecture is on environmental geopolitics. This lecture is a part of ongoing lecture series, Political Geography. In the same series, you had already 2 lectures on classical geopolitics and critical geopolitics. In this lecture, we would be talking on environmental geopolitics as a contemporary issue in geopolitical discourse. So, let us start this session. In this session, we would be talking on what is geopolitics in reference to environment and how environmental geopolitics is different from the classical geopolitical theories and geopolitical thought. We will also like to understand how environment play an important role in geopolitical discourse. What are the concerns for developing countries and developed countries in the climate change regime? Also, we would be trying to understand the environmental geopolitics in terms of sustainable development and climate change. So, before we go further in the lecture, let's understand what the geopolitics is. As I have already mentioned in my earlier lecture, which was on geopolitics and geostrategy, that geopolitics is related to impact of geography on the political dynamics of any state. And if we see the literal meaning of geopolitics, it means it is made up of 2 words, that is geo plus politics. Here the word geo refers to earth and politics refers to the interaction of countries on international forums. So, we can say that geopolitics is the study of how geography affects a country's interaction on international forums. In initial time, the concept was concerned with the spatial dynamics or spatial expansion of states, and also it was concerned with the distribution of land and sea on the earth's surface and its influence on states' power in international relations. But now the concept has modified drastically over a period of time. Many new themes and ideas evolved in the geopolitical discourse. These themes and issues that have been evolved in geopolitical discourse are like demography, politics, economy and environment. So, we can see in a more precise and contemporary manner that geopolitics is the study of how geography impacts politics, demography, economies and environment of any particular state with respect to developing their foreign policy. So, here we can also say now in the contemporary term that the concept of geopolitics is related to how countries interact and participate on international forums to maximize their gain and minimize their cost on international forums within their different geographic settings. So, now let's understand why geopolitics. Why environment is important in the geopolitical studies or geopolitical discourse. As I have already mentioned, there are many new themes evolved in the geopolitical discourse, and environmental concern is one of the most important issues which affect the international relations depending upon political and economic powers of the countries. So there are major two concerns of environment related to the international relation. That the first concern in sustainable development. In the present or contemporary scenarios, sustainable development is the most important thing what all the country wants to proceed for. So all countries wants to develop whether they want to develop socially or economically, they want their development to be sustainable. But there are many challenges for their sustainable development, and in environmental degradation and climate change is one of the major challenge to hamper their efforts for sustainable development. I would be talking on sustainable development and climate change in brief further in the slides, but the major concern for climate change and sustainable development is any country can develop socially or economically within their political boundaries, but climate change or degrading environment hampers their development prospects. If a country develops within their political boundaries and they emit certain amount of greenhouse gases, and these gases concentrate into the atmosphere doesn't know or doesn't work according to political boundary. So due to the act of other country, all the world are going to suffer and is suffering for their development prospects. So there are major certain geopolitical concern in terms of sustainable development and climate change. These are conflict between degrading environment and development of a state. I have already mentioned, if a country develops or does some economic activity, it contributes to greenhouse gas emission to a certain level, and these greenhouse gas emission and concentration into the atmosphere hampers the quality of favorable environment for development for all the countries, because environment and climate change doesn't work according to political boundaries. So if a country particular emits certain level of greenhouse gas, it affects all the country throughout the world. And the other point is, due to irresponsible act of few countries, many countries are forced to be backward. So this is just a supporting statement. If a country, suppose some industrialized countries are mainly responsible for greenhouse gas emissions, but due to these emission and concentration, many developing countries are forced to be backward. They are already vulnerable, they do not have such resources to develop or to cope or adapt with the impacts of climate change. So that they are just forced to be backward. They cannot initiate their own development projects or adaptation projects. So they have to rely on developed countries for their mitigation and adaptation measures. So now let's understand first the sustainable development and the climate change in brief. The term sustainable development is very popular nowadays. Everyone must be heard about the term. The term first used in 1987 by the report published by Brundtland Commission in 1987, and this report defines the term sustainable development as development that meets the need of present generation without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs. It has three domains, what you can see here, that is environment, social and economic domains. It integrates all the three domains, and it is basically a process of equitable resource use that aims to fulfill human needs while preserving the environment, so that these needs can be fulfilled not only in the present but in the future also. It also talks about the equity. It also favors the equity between continent and countries, between races and classes, genders and ages. So it favors equity while protecting environment, while doing social development and while proceeding for economic development. It includes social development, economic opportunity on the one hand, and the requirement of the environment on the other. It is based on improving the quality of life for all, especially for the poor and deprived, within the carrying capacity of the supporting environment. All of the three domains of sustainable development are integrated. We cannot avoid any of the one for the sake of development in another sector. For example, we cannot avoid or neglect environment for the sake of our economic development, or we cannot avoid our social empowerment, social inclusion for the sake of our economic development. They are all three domains are independent, and this is basically a multidimensional way of thinking about the interdependency among natural, social and economic system in our world. It represents a process in which economic, finance, trade, energy, agriculture and all other policies are implemented in a way to bring about development that is economically, socially and environmentally sustainable. So, there are lots of challenges that are present in terms of sustainable development that all the countries are facing. There are in terms of poverty, in terms of shelter, in terms of food security, water security and environmental degradation. There are few observations of United Nations which I would like to brief you with. For example, in terms of poverty, 1.3 billion people live on less than $1 per day, and 3 billion people live on less than $2 per day. And it is very important to note that 20% of income group uses 86% of resources, while bottom 20% of income group uses only less than 1.3% of resources. In terms of shelter, many live in areas that are susceptible to civil strife, environmental degradation and natural disasters. Food security is another concern and challenge for sustainable development, as around 800 million people are malnourished today, and with the present growth rate in population, the food production needs to be double in the next 35 years. Water security is another concern, as 1.3 billion people are living without clean water access, and 2 billion people are living without proper sanitation. Energy security is the next concern for sustainable development, as throughout the world 2 billion people are living without access to electricity. Environmental degradation is another concern, as 1.4 billion people are exposed to dangerous levels of outdoor pollution, and even larger number of people are exposed to dangerous levels of indoor pollution and vector-borne diseases. Since I have already mentioned, environment is the great concern for sustainable development, and refugees or migration due to climate change or environment is another concern, as United Nations High Commission on Refugees reports that annual disaster has displaced more than 26 million people per year since 2008, and almost a third of the total number of for this population are forcibly displaced people in this time period. So, this is a major concern that is due to climate change or environmental degradation, but this concern is always underestimated, but it also contributes to global instability to a large scale. And since all of these challenges are present for the sustainable development of all the countries, climate change always adds to these challenges. So, let's understand first what the climate change means. There are major two institutions that are dedicated to study and research in terms of climate change. The first is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and the second one is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So there are two definitions given by these two institutions. As per IPCC, that is Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it defines the term climate change as a change in the state of climate that can be identified by the changes in the mean or variability in its properties that persist for an extended period, typically decades or longer. Climate change may be due to natural internal process or external forcing, or to the persistent anthropogenic changes in the composition of the Earth atmosphere. And the other definition is given by UNFCCC. It defines a change of climate which attributes directly or indirectly to human activity that alters the composition of the global atmosphere, and which is in addition to natural climate variability observed over a comparable time period. So these are major two definitions given by two reputed institutions. If we analyze these two definitions, we find certain characteristics about climate change. For example, climate change is a significant and lasting change in the distribution of weather pattern over a periods ranging from decades to millions of years. It may be a change in average weather conditions or distribution of events around that average. The term climate change sometimes used to refer specifically to climate change caused by human activities and not including the Earth's natural process. The climate change is not a new phenomena. The climate changes from glacial to non-glacial ages, but the present concern is the current climate change which are being done due to the anthropogenic reasons. So, the climate change, the present concern for the climate change is the anthropogenic reasons, the emission of greenhouse gases and its concentration into the atmosphere. So, let's see how a climate responds or how it changes through from increased emission and concentration of greenhouse gases. The climate change is caused by increased greenhouse gas concentration into the atmosphere. It responds to the increase in greenhouse gas concentration through sea level rise, increase in air and surface temperature, increase in climate variability and extreme events. Climate response also have certain impact for socio-economic structure of human society. For example, it causes coastal submergence, salinization of coastal aquifers, salt water intrusion, coral bleaching, physical damages, destruction of human settlements, reduced tourism and damage to property and casualty from extreme events. It also causes adverse impacts for human health, agriculture and fisheries, and water availability, food security, etc. So it has a many impact for socio-economic and environmental concern of the earth. But here I would like to mention that these impact varies from country to country, region to region, according to their regional locations, according to their political and economic capability or adaptive capacity. Suppose some country are located in the zone the region which is less vulnerable to the climate change impacts, and it has all the adaptive capacity and resources to cope with and adapt with the impacts, then the impact will be less for those countries in comparison to the country who are located in a vulnerable or climate sensitive zone like tropical regions of the world. So here I would like to tell you that the tropical region of the world is the most vulnerable places in the world. Here I would like to take an example of Pacific region, where you can clearly see the difference when the global sea level rise is 3.2 millimeter per year. The Micronesia is experiencing sea level rise at the rate of 10 millimeter per year, whereas the tropical Western Pacific island have experienced sea level rise at the rate of 12 millimeter per year from 1993 to 2009, which is about 4 times higher than the global average of sea level rise. And if we see waves and winds pattern in the Pacific region, then we will find that it is also changing drastically. In the graph you can easily see after 2000 the rate of wind and waves, the changing rate of wind and waves are quite high. So if we compare the comparison of average western tropical Pacific sea level and aptitude of zonal wind stress, you can see the great difference from mid 90s to 2010. The third observed difference we can find in the increasing ocean acidification. In the oceanic region, acidification is another major concern for climate change. The graph here, the third graph here shows the correlation between the rate of CO2 concentration into the atmosphere and ocean acidification. As more carbon dioxide accumulates in the ocean, the pH level of ocean decreases and ocean acidification increases. And in the present rate, coral reefs are expected to be damaged from the rises in the frequency of bleaching event, while in the region is likely to lose 1.1 to 13 of its mangroves wetland with these rate of ocean acidification. So we can see that development also cause the greenhouse gas emission and thus climate change, and climate change also hampers all the development prospects of human society. So we can say this there is an integration between climate domain and sustainable development domain, because humans or every development activity, whether it is economic growth, technology, population or governance, contribute to a certain level of greenhouse gas emissions and its concentration in atmosphere. Each and every activity from present world contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. These concentration and emission of greenhouse gases contribute variation in the climatic system in terms of temperature rise, in terms of variation in precipitation pattern, in terms of sea level rise and increasing and variable drought and flood events. So variation in these climatic systems also have adverse impact on human and natural system like food security, water security, adverse impact on health, ecosystem degradation and biodiversity loss. So the country, the international community need to look all the climate issues and sustainable development issue all together. Both of them cannot be treated separately. So what we need to do, we have to look and we have to see how these two domains can be integrated for all countries. Developed country can do it better for themselves, but they have to take the responsibility to assist developing countries also to take their adaptive and sustainable development efforts. So now let's see, after understanding the climate change and the sustainable development, their issues and their integration, let's understand what are the geopolitical debate in terms of sustainable development and climate change which is going on in the climate change regime. The first, there are few factors Exactly, there are few factors around which all the debate is found. For the first factor is north-south perceptual difference. When I say north-south perceptual difference, I want to say that all the industrialized countries that are developed are generally located in the northern hemisphere of the globe, and all the developing countries which are vulnerable, poor and weak, they are located in the southern hemisphere of the globe. So the word north and south is just denoting words for developed industrialized country and weak vulnerable, and the south word denotes weak and vulnerable countries. So the second factor is common but differentiated responsibilities. The phrase is first used in the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the common but differentiated responsibility. It refers that to curb greenhouse gas emission is responsibility for all country. It is common responsibility for all country in the world, but the responsibility to mitigate, the responsibility to curb is differentiated among countries depending on their historical contribution and their adaptive capacity and their economic development. And the third important factor is non-willingness of major emitter countries, whether it is developed or developing country, to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, knowing the fact that it has a devastating impact for the entire world. So if you want to visualize the north-south difference, you can see this picture here. In the first picture, you can easily visualize that all the developing countries or developed countries, which are the great emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, which is all are shading in red or orange. All the countries are located in the northern hemisphere, which has the high emission rate, and the country who are the vulnerable and the sufferer ones are located in the southern hemisphere and are referred as the blue color. And in the second image, you can see just opposite to the first image, all the vulnerable countries who has the high level of vulnerability are located in the high vulnerable regions are located in the southern hemisphere, who has the less emission rates, but who has the high emission rate like industrialized country, they have the less vulnerability rate. So it's a vice versa, or we can say it is an irony that who contributes the least to the global climate change are the most vulnerable places in the world, and they are the one who are present in the front line to face the consequences of the climate change. So why the certain countries, why developing countries or countries of the south, why these are more vulnerable? If we see, there are certain characteristics they share which make them especially vulnerable. For example, impacts are worse for them because they are already they face lots of floods, drought, and they share a large section of their economy is in the primary sector, which is already a climate sensitive sector. So they are their economy is very climate sensitive. The second point is they have lower capacity to adopt because they lack financial, technological or institutional capacity, and they also lack the access to knowledge how to adapt or how to structure their resources to adapt with climate change impacts. And thirdly, climate change impacts are disproportionately upon the poorest country and the poorest people, which increases their inequality in health status and access to adequate food, clean water and other resources. So if we like to see that the major emitter countries, then we find that like Canada, Japan, United States, UK are the major emitter countries, and you can also see here major developing countries are also listed like Brazil, India and China. So Brazil, India and China is also in the list of higher emitter, and China, being a developing country, it is the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. So climate change also presents some geopolitical threats and opportunities, as climate change could drive a more collaborative approach to international relations, extending to areas such as energy security, conflict prevention and development, as there are many provisions under UNFCCC or climate change regime for energy security and cooperation like clean development mechanism and joint implementations. Additionally, as a threat, climate change could increase tension between and within groups and countries, leading to a politics of insecurity as countries focus on protecting themselves against impact. Due to diverging interest of countries and overlapping groupings of countries during the negotiations process, and vulnerable countries like SIDS and LDCs are very insecure in the face of climate change impacts. So climate besides all these terms, climate change also raises resource instability and conflicts, as climate change increases volatility of resources, availability in water, land, fisheries, etc. In many regions, disputes of resources become identified on communal lines like ethnicity, caste, religion, or it increases the underlying problem. In many areas, traditional resources governance system will be unable to cope with the increased stresses of climate change, resulting in the conflict and crisis. For resolving all these issues related to the climate change and its impact, climate change regime was formed, and there are negotiations for these issues are taking place under the UNFCCC to address these issues comprehensively, taking care of interest all the developed and developing countries. So we would be talking all these issues and UNFCCC negotiations in the next session. Thank you. Hello students, welcome to this session of the lecture Environmental Geopolitics. This is the second session of the topic. In the earlier session we had a talk on environmental geopolitics, as we had talked on environment as a major cause of concern in the geopolitical discourse. What are the concerns related to the developed and developing countries? We had also a talk on sustainable development and climate change and its impact on geopolitical discourse. So in this session we would be talking on how countries participate and position themselves in international negotiations or international forums to save their interest, and how weak countries position themselves, or how they strategize their actions to save their interest or to bargain with developed countries in climate negotiations. So let's start this session by looking at the objective of the session. We would be talking in this session on evolution of climate change regime. We would be talking on what are the provisions under United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, what are the actors and what are their geopolitical concern in the climate change regime, what are the major strategies that weak country adopt to save their interest and to bargain with developed country parties in the climate change negotiations. So, before starting this session, I just wanted to brief you what are the different tools that are present to deal with all climate change issue and its impact at the global, regional and countrywide level. So, at the global level, there are two major institutions, that is United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, that is UNFCCC, and its legally binding agreement, that is Kyoto Protocol. At the regional level, it has many other provisions, for example, tradable quotas of greenhouse gas emission, joint implementation, clean development mechanism, harmonized emissions, carbon or energy taxes, quotas, international technology and product standard, voluntary agreement from developed and developing countries, direct international transfer of finance, resources and technology. At the countrywide level, it has emissions, carbon and energy taxes, subsidies, deposit fund system, voluntary agreements that permits tradable and not tradable quotas, technology and performance standards, product ban, direct government spending on the research and development investment. So, let's now talk about the climate change regime. The climate change regime evolved in as early as in 1988, when the IPCC was adopted at the Second World Climate Conference. IPCC, that is dedicated for research and study in terms of scientific findings for climate change. In 1990, IPCC came up with its first assessment report having a very many adverse impact on social and economic development of human society. Realizing the fact that it is very urgent to deal climate change, United Nations General Assembly adopted United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change at Rio Earth Summit in 1992. So, by then the climate change regime was evolved. So, in the climate change regime, all the negotiation process, all the scientific finding, research and development, everything are taking place in that regime only. So, the first thing is United Nations Convention on Climate Change. It is an intergovernmental treaty which was adopted in 1992 at the Earth Rio Summit in Rio de Janeiro, and it entered into force in 1994. The convention was adopted with the primary objective to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions and concentration in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So, it has it also works on a principle of common but differentiated responsibility, as I have already mentioned in the earlier session, that it is a principle which dedicated to differentiate the responsibility to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions between developed and developing countries. It says that to curb the emission The responsibility to curb the emission is common for all countries, but the responsibility to curb varies from country to country depending on their historical contribution to the greenhouse gas emission and concentration, and their economic or adaptive capacity to adapt with the impacts. So, the convention works through conference of parties. The conference of parties is the highest decision making authority in the climate change regime. The conference of party takes place every year, and through all the countries and parties. Here I say parties are those countries who are the signatories of the convention. At present, the convention has universal membership of almost 195 countries from throughout the world. So, all the parties in the convention, or we can say climate change regime, are divided into three major categories. The first category is Annex 1 countries. These countries are generally developed countries and a member of Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development in 1992, and all the countries which has the economy in transition. And the second group of country is called Annex 2 countries. It also has all the countries without economy in transitions, and these Annex 2 countries are developed countries which need to provide all the financial and technological assistance to developing country to undertake measures to undertake emission reduction activities, and to help them to undertake all the adaptation measures for the adverse impacts of climate change. It also requires to take all the practicable steps to promote development and transfer of environmental friendly techniques, or to economy in transition countries and developing countries. So, these are major two groups which has a developed country in it. The third group is non-Annex 1 countries. These group has mostly developing and vulnerable countries in it. Major group consists of small island developing states and least developed countries, who are the most vulnerable places in the world in terms of climate change. Small island developing states are those countries who share some common characteristics and generally low-lying coastal and island countries. They are geographically disadvantaged and located in the most vulnerable places in the world. Least developed countries are economically backward countries. They do not have such resources to cope with or adapt with climate change impacts. So, these are party groupings in the climate change regime. If we see the mechanism, then it has Kyoto Protocol as its first legally binding agreement. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted at the third conference of parties in 1997. Kyoto Protocol is a multilateral environmental agreement with the goal of reducing global greenhouse gas emissions. It legally binds developed countries to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by at least 5% below 1990 level, and these targets vary by country. The Kyoto Protocol has two commitment periods. The first commitment period was from 2008 to 2012, and the second commitment period is going on from 2013 to 2020. And it is very important to note here that the second commitment period was signed by EU and few other developed country parties, and which has the implication that notable exclusion of US, Canada, Japan, Norway, etc. has the severe impact on greenhouse gas emission reduction. The developed country who has signed the second commitment period are responsible just for 15% of the total greenhouse gas emission. And notable exclusion of these major emitters will be responsible for beyond 2020, the rate of emission cut would be third time higher than now, and the temperature, and in that scenario the temperature rise may be expected at 3.5 degree Celsius. So it has a great impacts and very less relevance to mitigate the climate to mitigate the greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. The Kyoto Protocol has also some flexible mechanisms for meeting the targets. For example, it has joint implementation, clean development mechanisms, and emission trading. These are the systems to utilize greenhouse gas emissions overseas and initial allocation for achieving the greenhouse gas emission target in each country. In terms of joint implementation, it allows industrialized country to meet part of their required cut in greenhouse gas emissions by paying for projects that reduce emission in other industrialized country. In practice, this will likely mean to facilitate built in the countries of Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union. The transition economy paid for by Western European and Northern American countries. The other important mechanism is clean development mechanism. This allows a country with implementing emission reduction projects between developed countries and developing countries, and such projects can earn saleable certified emission reductions for developed countries, and these units can be counted towards meeting Kyoto Protocol targets. The third mechanism is emission trading. Emission trading allows country to sell their spare assigned amount unit which is not used to those countries that are over their targets. This helps them to meet their reduction target and earn credit or finance for unused assigned amount unit through carbon market. This mechanism treats carbon as a commodity. So these are basically main mechanisms for mitigating the climate change greenhouse gas emissions, and also allows country to use their finance or monetary resources to meet their targets. So let's see what are the major demands of vulnerable weak countries. So let's see this. They always want or they always favor these stand in climate negotiations, like they want consideration for their extreme vulnerability, they want significant reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, they want to limit global temperature rise well below 1.5 degrees Celsius. They want new and additional financial resources to support climate change adaptation and mitigation in developing countries. They also want consideration of loss and damage apart from the adaptation and mitigation assistance. They also want involvement of all parties in keeping with common but differentiated responsibility as mentioned in the convention. So these are major demands which generally developing country wants to speak for in climate change negotiations, and there are many initiatives have been taken up, there are many decisions that have been taken up for, and some of them for in favor of developed country parties. There are some decisions that favors developing country parties, but the overall objective of all decisions that are being taken up in climate change regime is just to curb the greenhouse gas emissions or limit the climate change. So for example, let's say in Cancun agreement in 2010, for the first time developing countries took part in emission reduction despite the principle of common but differentiated responsibility. In Cancun agreement, also it includes voluntary pledges made by 76 developed and developing countries to control their emission of greenhouse gases. And it is very important to note here that in that time, these 76 countries were collectively responsible for 85% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And at the Durban Climate Conference in 2011, the major decision was taken as extension of Kyoto Protocol was proposed in that conference. 8-year extension was proposed from 2013 to 2020 with the same provision as it was in first commitment period, and the second commitment period was signed by only EU and few other developed country parties. So, and other major decision that have been taken up is all the parties have agreed to develop another legal binding provision for all parties, including developing countries, which was adopted in Conference of Party 21 in 2015, that is called Paris Agreement, and this is a major development in climate change regime. So, in 2012 in Doha Climate Conference, an 8-year extension which was proposed in earlier conference was granted until 2020, and due to the lack of participation of Canada, Japan, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine and few other developed country parties, it has very limited scope to only 15% of the global emission of carbon dioxide are responsible for that, and also due to the fact that developing countries like China, which is the world's largest emitter, India and Brazil are not subject to any emission reduction under the Kyoto Protocol. And the conference also made a little progress towards the funding under the Green Environment Fund. And at the Warsaw Climate Conference, another major development that has been done for developing country parties is the consideration given to loss and damage issue. It said that loss and damage that was due to the climate change impact and could not be avoided through a proper mitigation and adaptation measure should be provided with $100 billion annually from developed country parties to developing countries from 2020 onwards, and $10 billion annually from 2010 and 2012. So, these are major decisions that have been taken up in recent climate negotiations, and the most important decision was Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015 COP21. It has many provisions for each and every issue related to the climate impacts, and it also first time brought developed country parties as well as developing countries parties on the same table to curb their emissions. So, in terms of temperature, Paris Agreement says to keep temperature well below 2 degrees Celsius and continue to all efforts to limit the temperature rise to 1.5 degree Celsius. In terms of finance, it talks about rich country must provide $100 billion from 2020 as a floor, and this amount to be updated by 2025. In terms of differentiation, the Paris Agreement says developed country must take the lead and developing countries are encouraged to enhance their efforts and move over emission cuts. So, in greenhouse gas emissions, in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the Paris Agreement talks like greenhouse gas emissions should peak as soon as possible somewhere from 2017 to 2020, and from 2025 onwards rapid reduction should be made to achieve climate neutrality. In terms of burden sharing, the Paris Agreement says developed countries must provide financial resources to help developing countries, and other countries are also encouraged and invited to provide voluntary support to all the vulnerable and weak countries. the Paris Agreement also has a review mechanism. A review every 5 years was scheduled with Paris Agreement after 2020, and each review will inform countries in updating and enhancing their reduction pledges. Also, the Paris Agreement talks and addresses the vulnerability issue of all the developing countries, as vulnerable countries want recognition in the need of preventing, minimizing and addressing losses suffered due to climate change. So, these are the major decisions that have been taken up. Now, let's see what are the groupings or what are the actors that participate in the climate change regime. As I have already mentioned, that in the climate change regime, the parties are generally participate in the three groups: Annex 1, Annex 2 and non-Annex 1 countries. Apart from this, following the UN tradition, the countries are also grouped into 5 regional groupings like African state, Asian state, Eastern European state, Latin America and Caribbean state, Western European and other state. So, all the countries and groupings have, every country in the climate change regime have different kind of interest, different kind of concern in terms of climate change, depending on their geographic location, depending on their economic, social and political structure. So, generally what they do, they generally look for their like-minded countries or group of countries. They join hand with them just to make their voice heard, or just to make their voice and concern stronger. So, if we see, then we find many interest groups are also there, groupings are also formed in the climate change regime. For example, Group of 77 and China, Alliance of Small Island States, Least Developed Countries, European Union, the Umbrella Group, Environmental Integrity Group. All of these groups also act in the climate change regime, and these all groups are interest-based group. In the diagram, if you see, then in these group also the countries overlap. A single country can be a part of 2 or 3 groups. If you see here, you can find it that the major, if there are 2 major groups like non-Annex 1 countries and Annex 1 countries. Some of, if we take example of AOSIS or G77 and China, we find that all the AOSIS members are also part of G77 and China, and some of the G77 and China, some of the member of G77 and China also a member of LDCs and other regional interest groups. So, all these overlapping groupings and overlapping issues make the negotiation process more complex and difficult to reach any comprehensive conclusions. So, if I take example of G77 and China and AOSIS, then we find that some of the AOSIS member is all the member of AOSIS and G77 and China, being a developing country, all holds a view as a group that emission reduction cut should be limited to developed country parties. But few AOSIS member like Cook Island and Cyprus, etc., who are not member of G77 and China, also holds the view that major developing country parties should also take the strong emission cut targets for emission reductions. So, these are overlapping groups and overlapping interest also makes the negotiation process more complex and difficult to manage and difficult to reach any conclusions. So, now at the last, let's understand what are the strategies that weak or poor country take in climate negotiations to get their voice heard or to save their interest. The first strategy they use is vulnerability based moral framing. They use this strategy since the initial time in climate change regime, just to pressurize developed country parties to take their concern, or this strategy presented them as a innocent victim of the actions of industrialized countries. The other strategy is borrowing power from second party. Being a powerless country, they do not have such resources. They do not have their strong voice to get themselves heard on the international forums. So all the civil societies and non-governmental organizations help them as their army behind. They protest for them, they speak for them. So they just get power from these third parties. They also get expertise from these type of institutions like civil society or NGOs. They generally take scientific and legal advice to make their voice heard, or they make their issues with more strongly, with all the proofs and support from all the legal advisories. They also prioritize their issues before going to international negotiations, just to focus on single issue to be achieved, leaving all the side issue behind. And weak countries also take lead in organizing meetings and conferences, just to make themselves serious actor in the climate change regime. So all these strategies they use from initial phases of the climate change regime till now, so that they have achieved so far in the terms of climate change. And there are many more things still to be left to find out. So these are the major geopolitical debates in terms of climate change. Thank you.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Bakshi for coming here and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.